"Your father would be ashamed of who you became," my mother-in-law Margaret announced loudly during our rehearsal dinner, her voice cutting through the restaurant's ambient chatter like a knife. A grown man who can't even afford a proper wedding venue. The entire room, 43 guests, including my fiancée Sarah's extended family, fell silent. I smiled calmly, pulled out my phone, and pressed play on a recording I'd been carrying for 3 months. Her husband's voice filled the room. "I've been having an affair for 2 years, Margaret doesn't know, but I'm leaving her after Sarah's wedding. My name is David Chen, I'm 29 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for Morrison & Associates in Seattle, Washington." That Saturday evening at Chez Laurent, watching Margaret's face drain of color as her husband's confession played through the restaurant sound system, I realized that patience and preparation always triumph over cruelty and arrogance. Sarah grabbed my arm, her engagement ring catching the candlelight. "David, what is this?" she whispered, but I held up my hand for silence. The recording continued. "The money Margaret thinks I'm investing for our retirement, I've been moving it to offshore accounts. She'll be left with nothing." 43 people heard every word. Margaret's brother stood up so fast, his chair toppled backward. I hadn't planned for this moment to happen during our rehearsal dinner. In fact, I'd hoped it would never happen at all. But Margaret had pushed me to this point with 18 months of systematic humiliation, and I'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them exactly what you're capable of. Sarah and I met 3 years ago at a charity gala where my firm was providing pro bono financial analysis for a local non-profit. She was volunteering as an event coordinator while finishing her master's degree in social work. We connected instantly over our shared commitment to helping others, and I was struck by her compassion and intelligence. She was everything I'd been looking for: kind, ambitious, and genuinely interested in making the world better. Her parents, however, were a different story entirely. Margaret Williams had been Seattle's self-appointed society queen for decades. Her husband, Robert, owned a successful import business, and they lived in a mansion in Magnolia with views of Puget Sound. From our first meeting, Margaret made it clear that I wasn't what she'd envisioned for her daughter. "Accounting," she'd said, when Sarah introduced my profession, the word dripping with disdain. How practical. The attack started small. Comments about my modest apartment in Ballard, questions about when I planned to move up from my current firm, suggestions that Sarah deserved someone with more ambition. I endured it all quietly, partly because I loved Sarah and partly because my father had taught me that responding to petty cruelty only dignifies it. My father, James Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in 1975 with nothing but an engineering degree and an unshakable work ethic. He'd built a successful civil engineering practice from scratch, putting 3 kids through college while never missing a single one of our school events. He passed away from pancreatic cancer 2 years before I met Sarah, and his absence was still a raw wound. Margaret seemed to sense this vulnerability and exploited it mercilessly. She'd make comments about how unfortunate it was that Sarah's children wouldn't have a grandfather to guide them. She'd suggest that my father probably would have wanted me to choose a more prestigious career path. Most cruelly, she'd mention how Sarah's future children would be missing that strong father figure influence. Each comment was carefully calculated, never quite crossing the line into obvious cruelty, but consistently designed to remind me that I was inadequate. Sarah would defend me afterward, but she didn't hear most of it. Margaret was clever enough to save her worst comments for when we were alone. The situation escalated 6 months ago when Sarah and I got engaged. Margaret immediately took control of the wedding planning, insisting that a mother knows best and that Sarah was too stressed with grad school to handle the details. She booked vendors without consulting us, chose flowers we'd never discussed, and invited people we'd never met. When I politely suggested that Sarah and I wanted more input in our own wedding, Margaret's mask slipped completely. "This family has standards, David," she said, her voice ice cold. "Standards your family clearly never taught you." That's when I started paying closer attention to the Williams family finances. My profession had taught me to notice patterns, inconsistencies, and red flags. Robert Williams claimed to be incredibly successful, but their spending patterns didn't match their reported income. Margaret wore designer clothes and drove a new Mercedes, yet their business showed declining profits for 3 consecutive years. They lived in a house worth $2.8 million, but had refinanced it twice in the past 18 months. Something wasn't adding up. I began what I called casual observation. At family dinners, I listened to Robert's phone calls. I noticed his reaction when certain topics came up. I watched Margaret's face when she thought no one was looking. Small details that individually meant nothing but together painted a picture of a family living far beyond their legitimate means. 3 months ago, Robert had too much wine at Sarah's birthday dinner. He stepped outside to take a call, and I followed to get some air. What I overheard changed everything. "The transfers need to stop after the wedding," he was saying to someone. "Margaret doesn't know about the accounts, and I can't risk her finding out before I make my move." He paused, listening. 2 years is long enough. I've moved enough offshore that she'll never find it. After Sarah's settled, I'm done. I stood in the garden processing what I'd heard. Robert wasn't just hiding money from Margaret. He was planning to abandon her after our wedding, leaving her financially destroyed. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd spent months attacking my character was married to a man planning the ultimate betrayal. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something colder, a sense of absolute clarity about what needed to happen. Next, I'm a forensic accountant. Finding hidden assets is literally what I do for a living. Over the next 3 months, I built a complete picture of Robert's financial deception. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, real estate investments hidden through shell corporations, a second home in Costa Rica, purchased under a false name, even a secret bank account where he'd been depositing the proceeds from selling Margaret's jewelry, pieces she thought were safely stored in their home. Safe? The total amount Robert had hidden, $3.7 million. Money that should have been community property, money that Margaret had every legal right to know about. He'd been planning this exodus for over 2 years, systematically stripping their marriage of assets, while maintaining the facade of a successful businessman. I documented everything. Account numbers, transfer dates, property deeds, even photographs of the Costa Rica house I found through public records. I created a comprehensive report that would hold up in any divorce court, complete with evidence that would make Robert's denials impossible. But I didn't plan to use it unless I absolutely had to. I hoped that Margaret would stop her attacks, that we could find some way to coexist peacefully for Sarah's sake. I even considered approaching her privately, woman to woman, to explain that I genuinely loved her daughter and wanted our families to get along. Those hopes died at our engagement party. Margaret had insisted on hosting the event at the Seattle Tennis Club, a venue that cost more than most people's annual salary. She'd invited 150 people, most of whom Sarah and I had never met. The party was less about celebrating our engagement and more about Margaret showing off her social connections. Halfway through the evening, Margaret stood up to give a toast. What followed was the most passive-aggressive character assassination I'd ever witnessed. "When Sarah was little," Margaret began, her voice carrying across the room, "she used to bring home stray animals. Dogs with 3 legs, cats with 1 eye. She always wanted to fix things that were broken." The room chuckled politely. I see that compassionate nature is still strong in her today. The implication was clear. I was damaged goods that Sarah was trying to fix out of misplaced kindness. "Sarah's father and I raised her to have high standards," Margaret continued, her eyes finding mine across the room. "We taught her that a woman should choose a partner who can provide security, stability, and social standing, someone whose family background reflects the values we hold dear." I felt Sarah tense beside me. Several guests looked uncomfortable, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Of course, not everyone has the advantage of growing up with strong male role models," she said, her smile never wavering. "Some people have to learn life's important lessons later than others. But I have. Faith that love can bridge any gap in upbringing." That was when I made my decision. Margaret had crossed a line from which there was no return. She'd mocked my father's memory in front of 150 people, questioned my worthiness as a partner, and insulted my family's values, all while her own husband was planning to financially destroy her. The irony was too perfect to ignore. I started carrying the recording of Robert's phone conversation everywhere I went. I transferred it to my phone, made backup copies, and prepared for the moment when Margaret would inevitably push too far. I didn't want to use it. Destroying someone's marriage, even someone who'd been cruel to me, wasn't something I took lightly. But I wasn't going to let her continue attacking my character. while living a lie herself. That moment came at our rehearsal dinner. Margaret had initially wanted to host the rehearsal at the tennis club as well, but Sarah and I had insisted on somewhere more intimate. We chose Chez Laurent, a small French restaurant in Belltown that held special meaning for us. It's where we'd had our third date, the night I knew I was falling in love with her. Margaret made her displeasure known from the moment we arrived. The restaurant was quaint, code for insufficient prestige. The menu was limited, not expensive enough. The guest list was small, only immediate family and wedding party, exactly as we'd requested. During dinner, she kept making comments about the modest venue and how she hoped our actual wedding would be more appropriate for the Williams family name. Robert, meanwhile, seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and making cryptic comments about finalizing some business arrangements. The final straw came during the traditional toasts. Sarah's maid of honor spoke beautifully about our relationship. My best man shared a funny story about how nervous I'd been before proposing. Then Margaret stood up, wine glass in hand, and I knew from her expression that something terrible was coming. "I've known Sarah for 28 years, Margaret began, her voice carrying that false warmth she used when she wanted to sound loving while delivering cruelty. "She's always been our perfect daughter. Beautiful, intelligent, accomplished. She could have had anyone." She paused, letting that sink in. "Sarah has such a big heart, sometimes too big. She sees potential where others might see limitations." My jaw tightened, but I remained silent. Beside me, Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "When Sarah was in high school, she dated the son of a federal judge," Margaret continued. "In college, she was pursued by a Rhodes Scholar. After graduation, she could have married into any of Seattle's finest families." The room was dead quiet now. Everyone could feel the cruelty building. Instead, she chose to follow her heart. She chose someone who— Margaret paused dramatically. "Someone whose background is so different from ours. Someone who grew up without the advantages we value. Someone whose father—" She looked directly at me, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Someone whose father would be ashamed of who he became. A grown man who can't even afford a proper wedding venue, who expects his fiancée's family to pay for everything because his own family never taught him how to provide." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt Sarah's hand grip mine. Under the table, her nails digging into my palm. Across the room, I saw my mother's face crumple with hurt. My sister Lisa looked murderous. For exactly 3 seconds, I considered letting it go, taking the high road, being the bigger person. Then I thought about my father, James Chen, who'd worked 70-hour weeks to give his children opportunities, who'd taught me that dignity wasn't about wealth or status, but about character and integrity, who'd shown me that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is simply being better than they are. Margaret had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the audio file I'd been carrying for 3 months, and connected it to the restaurant's Bluetooth sound system. The connection took exactly 4 seconds, 4 seconds of absolute silence, while 43 people waited to see how I'd respond to Margaret's devastating attack. I pressed play. Robert's voice filled the restaurant, crystal clear through the premium speakers. "I've been having an affair for 2 years. Margaret doesn't know, but I'm leaving her after Sarah's wedding. I can't keep living this lie." The effect was instantaneous. Margaret's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against her plate. Robert's face went white as printer paper. Sarah gasped and covered her mouth with both hands. But the recording wasn't finished. "The money Margaret thinks I'm investing for our retirement. I've been moving it to offshore accounts for the past 18 months. The house, the cars, even her jewelry. I've been liquidating everything and transferring it where she'll never find it. She'll be left with nothing but debt when I disappear." Margaret tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her brother James stood up so violently his chair crashed backward. Sarah's cousin Emma started crying. The woman at the next table turned to stare at our group with undisguised shock. "The Costa Rica property is in my name only," Robert's voice continued relentlessly. "New identity, new bank accounts, new life. 25 years of marriage, and she never suspected a thing. After the wedding, I'm gone. She'll wake up one morning to find divorce papers and empty accounts." I let the recording play for another 30 seconds. Details about specific accounts, transfer amounts, even Robert's plans for his new life in Central America. Then I calmly disconnected my phone and set it on the table. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Margaret sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Robert looked like he was considering making a run for the restaurant's back exit. The rest of the family stared at us with expressions ranging from shock to horror to something approaching admiration. Finally, Sarah found her voice. "David," she whispered, when did you—" "3 months ago," I said, quietly, my voice carrying in the dead silence. "Your father made that call during your birthday dinner. I was getting some air in the garden when I overheard." Margaret's brother James moved first. He stood up slowly, his face red with rage, and looked down at Robert. 25 years, he said, his voice shaking. 25 years of family dinners, holidays, watching you sit at our table while planning to destroy my sister. Robert finally found his voice. "You don't understand," he stammered. "This is taken out of context. That recording could be from anyone." "Your voice," Margaret whispered, the words barely audible. "That's your voice." "Margaret, listen to me," Robert said desperately. "This is some kind of setup. He's manipulating." I pulled out a folder I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket and slid it across the table to Margaret. "These are copies of the offshore account statements," I said calmly. "The property deed for the Costa Rica house. Transfer. Records showing $3.7 million moved from your joint accounts to accounts in Robert's name only." Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands. As she read, her face transformed from shock to understanding to pure fury. "You son of a bitch," she said, her voice rising to a shriek. "You goddamn son of a bitch." She lunged across the table at Robert, wine and water glasses flying. He caught her wrists, but she was beyond rational thought. 25 years, she screamed. "I gave you 25 years. It took James and 2 waiters to separate them. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every customer and staff member watching our family drama unfold like a real-life soap opera. Sarah turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I hoped I'd never have to use it," I said honestly. "I was waiting to see if your mother would stop attacking my family, if she'd learn to treat me with basic respect." I looked across the table at Margaret, who was being held back by her brother while she continued to scream at Robert. "But she crossed a line tonight. She mocked my father's memory in front of everyone we care about, so I decided it was time for some perspective." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Margaret had spent months questioning my character, my worthiness, my family's values, all while married to a man who was systematically stealing from her and planning to abandon her after our wedding. "How long have you known?" Sarah asked Robert, her voice barely controlled. "Sarah, sweetie, this isn't what it looks like," Robert said desperately. "Your mother and I have been having problems. The marriage has been over for years. I was trying to protect—" "Protect?" Margaret exploded. "You were stealing from me. Our retirement, our house, my grandmother's jewelry. You sold my grandmother's jewelry." "The jewelry was insured," Robert said weakly. "You never even noticed it." "Was gone." That admission hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sat down heavily, the fight draining out of her. "My grandmother's ring," she whispered. "You told me it was being cleaned." "I replaced it with a replica," Robert said, his voice barely audible. "The original it's gone." For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Williams looked truly vulnerable. 18 months of her attacking my character, questioning my worthiness, mocking my family, and all along she was the one being betrayed. Sarah stood up abruptly. "I need some air," she said, heading for the restaurant's patio. I followed her, leaving the Williams family to process the ruins of their carefully constructed facade. Outside, Sarah leaned against the railing overlooking Elliott Bay. The Seattle skyline glittered across the water, but she wasn't seeing any of it. "I'm so sorry," she said without turning around. "What my mother said about your father, that was unforgivable." "Thank you," I said simply. "But this," she gestured toward the restaurant, "this is going to destroy my family." I stepped beside her at the railing. "Your family was already destroyed, Sarah. Your father destroyed it 18 months ago when he started moving money offshore. I just provided the evidence." She was quiet for a long moment. "How did you know? How did you figure out the financial stuff?" "I'm a forensic accountant," I reminded her. "Finding hidden assets is what I do." When I heard that phone call, I couldn't just ignore it. Even if your mother and I don't get along, she doesn't deserve to be financially abandoned without warning. Sarah turned to look at me. You could have told me privately. We could have handled this as a family. And would your mother have believed it? Or would she have accused me of making it up to cause problems? Sarah's silence was answer enough. We both knew Margaret would never have believed such accusations coming from me. So you waited, Sarah said. You let her keep attacking you, knowing what you knew about my father. I hoped she'd stop, I said honestly. I kept thinking maybe we could find a way to coexist. For your sake, for our future children's sake. But tonight she went too far. Tonight she mocked my father's memory in front of everyone we love. And I decided that enough was enough. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the lights reflect on the water. Finally, Sarah asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now? Before I could answer, the restaurant's door burst open. Margaret stormed out, her face tear-streaked but determined. Behind her came James, Robert, and most of the dinner party. Where is he? Margaret demanded, looking around wildly. Where's Robert? He left through the kitchen, James said grimly. Took his car keys and ran. Margaret turned to me. The accounts, she said urgently. The offshore accounts, can they be frozen? I pulled out my phone and showed her a contact. Patricia Morrison, my boss. She's the best financial litigation attorney in the Pacific Northwest. If you call her tomorrow, she can start the process of recovering your assets. Margaret stared at the contact information, then looked up at me. Why? She asked. After everything I've said to you, why are you helping me? It was a fair question. This woman had spent 18 months systematically attacking my character, my family, my worthiness as a partner for her daughter. She'd mocked my father's memory in front of everyone we cared about. By any reasonable standard, I should have been celebrating her downfall. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. Because you're going to be my mother-in-law, I said simply, because despite everything, you love Sarah, and because no one deserves to be stolen from and abandoned like this. Margaret's face crumpled. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely grateful. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for what I said about your father. That was unforgivable. Yes, I agreed. It was. Can you... She struggled with the words. Can you forgive me? I looked at this woman who'd made my life miserable for 18 months, who'd questioned my character and mocked my family, who'd now lost everything she thought she knew about her own life. The anger I'd carried for so long seemed to evaporate. I can try, I said, but things are going to be different from now on. She nodded quickly. Yes, of course, whatever you need. I need you to treat me with the same respect you'd want for Sarah. I need you to acknowledge that my family has value, even if we don't have your social connections. And I need you to understand that I love your daughter more than anything in this world, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that to her. Margaret was crying openly now. I understand, she said. I promise. 3 months later, Sarah and I were married in a small ceremony in my mother's garden in Bellevue. The guest list was limited to people who genuinely loved and supported us. No social obligations, no status displays, no hidden agendas. Margaret attended alone. Robert had fled to Costa Rica the night after the rehearsal dinner, but not before Patricia Morrison had frozen every account she could find. The legal proceedings were ongoing, but Margaret had recovered roughly 60% of the stolen assets. The house would have to be sold to pay legal fees, but she wasn't destitute. More importantly, she was a different person. The crisis had stripped away her facade of superiority, revealing someone who was actually quite vulnerable and surprisingly genuine when she wasn't performing for Seattle society. She'd moved to a modest apartment in Capitol Hill and taken a job with a non-profit that helped women navigate divorce proceedings. She still had moments where her old habits surfaced, comments about venue choices or guest lists that suggested she thought she knew better than everyone else. But when I called her on it, she apologized, genuinely, and slowly, carefully, we were building something that resembled mutual respect. The wedding itself was perfect. My mother walked me down the aisle, carrying a photo of my father in her bouquet. Sarah's vows included a promise to honor the memory of the man who'd raised me to be worthy of her love. Margaret cried through the entire ceremony. Whether from happiness, regret, or grief for her own marriage, I couldn't tell. During the reception, Margaret approached me while Sarah was dancing with her uncle. I have something for you, she said, pulling out a small wrapped box. Inside was a watch, Not expensive, but clearly meaningful. It was my father's, she explained. My real father, not the stepfather who raised me. He died when I was young, and I've always regretted that I never got to introduce him to the man I married. She paused. I think he would have liked you better than Robert. It was as close to a full apology as I was likely to get, and I accepted it in the spirit it was offered. 6 months after our wedding, I received a call from Patricia Morrison. Robert had been arrested in Costa Rica on charges of money laundering and tax evasion. The US was seeking extradition. If convicted, he'd face substantial prison time and complete forfeiture of the hidden assets. Margaret took the news with surprising calm. Good, was all she said. Then, will this help other women he might have planned to do this to? It would. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Robert's scheme wasn't unique. He'd been part of a network of men who specialized in financially abusing their wives before abandoning them. Several other families would benefit from the evidence we'd provided. A year later, Sarah and I hosted Thanksgiving dinner at our new house in Queen Anne. Margaret came, bringing homemade pie and stories about her work at the non-profit. She'd started a support group for women who'd been financially abused, using her own experience to help others navigate the legal and emotional challenges of recovery. I learned something important this year, she told the table during grace. I learned that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their social connections. It's measured by how they treat the people they love and how they respond when someone needs help. She looked directly at me. David saved my life, she said simply. Not just financially, but emotionally. He showed me what real integrity looks like, even when I didn't deserve it. Later, as we were cleaning dishes, Margaret and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. I need to ask you something, she said. That night at the rehearsal dinner, did you plan it that way? Did you know I was going to say something about your father? I considered lying, giving her the comfortable answer. Instead, I chose honesty. I suspected you might, I said. You'd been building up to something for weeks, so yes, I was prepared. She nodded slowly. You could have destroyed me, she said. You had evidence of Robert's affair, his financial crimes, everything. You could have used it to humiliate me whenever you wanted. Yes, I agreed. I could have. But you waited until I crossed a line you couldn't ignore. I waited until you attacked my father's memory, I corrected. That was the one thing I couldn't let slide. Margaret was quiet for a moment, drying the same plate for the 3rd time. Your father would be proud of you, she said finally. Not ashamed. Proud. It wasn't until later that night, lying in bed next to Sarah, that I realized Margaret had managed to do something I'd never expected. She'd given me back my father's approval, which I'd never actually lost, but which her earlier words had made me question. 3 years have passed since that rehearsal dinner at Chez Laurent. Sarah and I are expecting our first child, a daughter we're planning to name Grace. Margaret has become an integral part of our lives, not the social climbing status seeker she once was, but a genuine grandmother-to-be who helps us paint the nursery and argues with Sarah about proper nutrition during pregnancy. Robert is serving 8 years in federal prison for money laundering and tax evasion. The house in Costa Rica was seized and sold, with the proceeds going to his victims. Margaret used her share to establish a foundation that provides legal aid to women escaping financially abusive marriages. Sometimes I think about that moment in the restaurant when I pressed play on that recording, the shocked silence, the family chaos that followed, the way everything changed in an instant. People often ask if I regret it, if I wish I'd handled the situation differently. The answer is no. Margaret needed to understand that her cruelty had consequences. Robert needed to face justice for his crimes. And I needed to prove to myself that I wouldn't allow anyone, regardless of their social status or family connections, to mock my father's memory without responding. But more than that, that night taught me something important about the nature of real strength. It's not about having the biggest house, or the most prestigious job, or the right social connections. It's about being prepared when someone tries to tear you down. It's about having the patience to wait for the right moment and the courage to act when that moment arrives. My father taught me that dignity isn't about wealth or status, it's about character. Margaret's attacks on my character ended up revealing her own husband's complete lack of it. In trying to prove I wasn't good enough for her family, she discovered that her family wasn't good enough for itself. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Last week, Margaret called to ask if I'd speak at her non-profit's annual fundraiser. The theme is recognizing real worth, and she wants me to share our story as an example of how people can surprise you when you give them the chance. I said yes, not because I've forgotten what she said about my father that night. I'll never forget that. But because I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing not to let the past control your future. Margaret Williams spent 18 months trying to prove I wasn't worthy of her daughter. In the end, she discovered that worthiness isn't about what you inherit or achieve. It's about how you respond when everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie. She responded by becoming a better person. I responded by becoming a better man. And Sarah got the family she deserved, not perfect but real. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's helping them become worthy of forgiveness. My father would be proud of that choice, I'm sure of it.